The sea had been falling for 3 seas straight when Yo-Jun stopped a mugging and accidentally saved the end of the world. He wasn't supposed to be out at all. His shift at the recycling center ended at 11, and it was nearly midnight, and the rain was the kind of cold that got into your collar no matter what you wore. But he'd heard the sound. A sharp cry cut short from the alley beside the noodle shop that had been closed for 6 months, and he'd turned toward it before he'd thought to turn away. There were 4 of them, large men in dark coats, not the lazy posture of street thugs, but something tighter, more deliberate, military in the way they moved. And they had a woman pressed against the wall. June had no weapon. He was 5'9", 162 pounds, and his only formal training was 18 months of taekwondo he'd done in high school because the community center had offered a discount. He also had a very clear policy about minding his own business, which he had constructed after years of bitter experience, and which he now threw directly into the gutter. He picked up a broken section of pipe from the alley floor and stepped into the light. "Hey!" The 4 men turned. Their faces were blank in a way that felt practiced. One of them reached into his coat. June didn't wait to see what was inside it. He was not by any reasonable measure a skilled fighter. But he was fast in the particular way that frightened people sometimes are. All reflex and adrenaline, and the half-mad conviction that stopping was worse than continuing. And the first man went down before the others registered movement. The second caught the pipe across the forearm. The third one got June's elbow in his nose, which surprised June more than the man it hit. The fourth backed up, reassessed, and reached again for his coat. The woman moved. June didn't see exactly what she did. He had a brief impression of a hand extended, fingers splayed, and then the fourth man was on his back on the wet concrete, rigid as a board, eyes open and blinking very fast. June stood in the rain with the pipe dripping in his hand. The 3 other men were already getting up, stumbling toward the alley entrance, helping each other. The fourth was still on the ground but beginning slowly to curl. The woman said something he didn't understand. Not Korean, not any language he recognized. Then she switched with a strange flattening of consonants. "Thank you for the assistance." She was around his age, or appeared to be. Dark eyes, sharp features, a stillness about her that reminded him of the way a mantis held itself on a leaf, perfectly motionless and completely present. She was wearing a pale jacket 3 sizes too large, belted with a strip of wire, and she was soaking wet and apparently untroubled by it. "Who were those men?" he asked. "Competitors," she said. Then, "I require shelter until dawn. I will explain what I can." He should have said no. He said, "I live 4 blocks from here." Or the sound she allowed him to use was something close to Mona. She sat across from him at his small kitchen table, both of them with cups of instant coffee that neither of them were drinking. And she told him the truth in the flat, careful way of someone who has decided that honesty is simply the most efficient option. She was a biological collector. Her species reproduced through a process requiring compatible genetic material from other intelligent life forms. Not a merger, more a borrowing, a kind of deep biological sampling that left both parties intact. She had come to this planet 18 months ago as a researcher of sorts, tasked with identifying a viable donor. The men in the alley were from a competing faction, a group on her planet that wanted the same thing but were willing to take rather than ask. "You want my DNA," June said. "A specific self contribution," she said. "Voluntary. The process requires consent to function correctly. Coercion produces incompatible material. This is biologically determined, not ethical preference, though I am told the distinction matters to your species." "It does," he said. "I thought so." She tilted her head. "You are the 4th human I have approached." The others declined. "I am running out of time." "When, dawn?" She looked at the window. The rain was letting up, smearing the glass into streaks of orange streetlight. "I have approximately 6 hours." He looked at her for a long time. She looked back without blinking, which was disconcerting. "Why me?" he asked. "You said I was the 4th. Why come back to the alley where those men were hunting you? Why not just go find a 5th person?" Something shifted in her face. Not much. She didn't have a large vocabulary of expression, but something. "You turned toward the sound," she said. "Everyone else on that street turned away. I had been watching for 3 hours, and no one on that block turned toward a thing that was not their business." June was quiet. "It is a selecting factor," she said. "On my world, the ones who turn toward." He got up and put the kettle on again, even though the water was still hot, just to have something to do with his hands. He thought about the policy he'd built over years of getting into trouble, and about how he'd built it, and about the specific day. Clear as a photograph, when he'd promised himself he would stop walking into things that weren't his problem. He thought about his father, who'd had the same problem, and how he died 6 years ago on a highway median, having pulled over to help someone whose car had stalled, struck from behind by a truck whose driver had been on his phone. The newspaper had called it a tragedy. His aunt had called it exactly what happened to people who couldn't leave things alone. He thought about all of this very carefully, and then he turned around. "I have conditions," he said. She waited. "I want to understand exactly what the process involves, not a summary. Everything. That will take approximately 40 minutes to explain accurately. Then start talking." She talked for 50 minutes because he kept asking questions, and the questions were good ones. She answered all of them. He stood at the counter and listened, and occasionally refilled the cups, and when she was done, he sat back down across from her. "The men who were chasing you," he said, "if they get to a donor first, the material they collect would be used to produce offspring optimized for extraction rather than exchange. My faction would call it an act of aggression. There would be a response." She paused. "On your world, how big a response?" She was quiet for a moment. "Your atmosphere is not currently hospitable to my species. That would be corrected." He absorbed this. "You're telling me the stakes. I thought you deserved to know them. You asked for full information." Outside, someone's scooter started up and coughed away into the wet dark. A dog was barking somewhere 2 streets over, persistent and lonely. "My father," June said, "used to say that the problem with doing the right thing is that nobody ever tells you in advance which thing is the right thing. You just have to pick one and live with it." He stood up. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk about what happens next." What happened next was the Jenga. He didn't know how that started exactly. She had asked if he wanted to sleep. Rest periods improve decision quality in your species, and he'd said he didn't think he could. And she'd noticed the box on the shelf, and he'd said that was a game for building a tower and taking pieces out without it falling. And she'd said she understood structural integrity puzzles and would like to participate. They played for 2 hours. She was methodical and unhurried and pulled pieces with a steadiness that made him nervous. He was nervous and pulled pieces with the slight tremor of someone trying not to look nervous. The tower fell twice, his fault both times, and she rebuilt it without comment, the blocks arranged back into precise rows. Around 2 in the morning she said, without looking up from the tower, "You are afraid." "Yes." "Of me specifically or of the situation?" He thought about it. "Both. More the situation. That is reasonable." She pulled a piece from the lower third, moving it in a slow quarter rotation that should have brought the tower down and somehow didn't. "I am also afraid. I did not say this earlier because it was not relevant to the information you needed to make a decision. Is it relevant now?" She set the piece on top. "I think so. You have already decided. Now I think we are just sitting here." They were. He understood that. "What does it feel like?" he asked. "Being this far from home." The question seemed to land differently than he'd intended. She was still, a moment, fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the silence was the kind that only comes after long water. "There is a word in my language," she said slowly, "that refers to the feeling of existing in a place that does not know your name. Not loneliness exactly, closer to transparency, as if you might simply become less present by degrees and no one would notice the difference." "That," June said, "is the most human thing anyone has ever said to me." She looked at him. "We have a word for that too," he said. "We have like 40 words for that." Something in her face broke open, very slightly, like a seam giving way. It wasn't a smile, it was something prior to a smile, a recognition, the moment before the expression forms. They talked until 4 in the morning. He made rice, because he cooked badly but reliably, and they ate it standing at the counter, and she told him about the color of her homeworld sky. Not blue but a deep muted green, like oxidized copper, and the way light there came from 2 sources simultaneously and cast shadows in 2 directions. And how for years after she'd arrived on Earth, she would catch herself looking for her second shadow and not finding it, and feeling, briefly, like she was missing something she couldn't name. He told her about his father, not the death, the life, the man who couldn't walk past a broken thing without stopping, who had spent an entire Saturday once helping a stranger on their street repair a fence that wasn't his fence, on a block he didn't live on, because the woman who owned it was 83 years old and her son hadn't come. "He sounds like someone worth inheriting from," she said. "I used to wish I was more like him," June said. "Then he died doing it, and I decided to be less." "But you turned toward the sound." He didn't say anything. "The inheritance resists revision," she said. "I have observed this in multiple species. What your parents showed you how to be stays lodged in the body somewhere. You can practice against it, but you cannot practice it out entirely." He thought, "I have never told anyone that, and somehow that is the exact right thing to say about it." he thought. This is very strange. He also thought, the men in the dark coats are still out there, and it is 4 in the morning, and dawn is in 2 hours. The men came back at 4:30. Not the same 4. Different ones. More of them. And they came through the front door and the window simultaneously in the way of people with actual training and actual equipment. June was in the kitchen. He heard the door come off its hinges and moved without thinking, grabbing the closest thing, a frying pan, heavy steel, a gift from his mother. And he was in the hallway when the first man cleared the door. What followed was less a fight than a sustained disagreement about who was allowed to be in his apartment, prosecuted with the particular desperation of a man who cannot afford for the argument to go wrong. He caught one man in the chest with the pan. He got another's wrist before the man could bring up what was in his hand. He took a blow to the ribs that would hurt for a week and drove his knee into someone's thigh in the specific way his old Taekwondo instructor had shown him, which he'd always assumed was theoretical. Mona came out of the back room. She wasn't panicked. That was the thing he'd remember later. She moved through the chaos with the calm of someone who has simply decided which parts of physics apply to her, and the men in the coats could not seem to anticipate her. She didn't fight exactly. She intervened, a touch here that made a man's hand open involuntarily. A sound, low, below what should have been audible, that made 2 of them check their feet as if the floor had moved. One man lunged for her and she sidestepped with a smoothness that looked like water going around a stone. The whole thing lasted maybe 4 minutes. When it was over, there were 6 men on the floor in various states of consciousness, and June was standing in his own hallway, holding a dented frying pan, and his ribs were screaming. "Are you hurt?" Mona said. "Maybe," he said. "I've been better, are you?" "I am unharmed." She looked at him steadily. "You protected me again. You protected yourself. I was just also there." "You turned toward," she said, again. He laughed, which hurt, and then had to stop laughing. They moved to the back room with the door wedged shut, and she looked at his ribs with a kind of focused attention that he supposed was something like medical examination, and told him nothing was broken, only bruised, and, when she pressed her palm to the side of his torso briefly, the heat was extraordinary, not painful, almost comforting, like a heated stone. "What was that?" he asked. "A property of my biology," she said. "Thermal regulation. It sometimes assists healing in inflammatory tissue. I should have asked first." "It's fine," he said. "Thank you." Outside, sirens, far off, moving towards somewhere else. "June," she said, and he noticed she was using his name for the first time. "The faction that sent those men, they will have more. They will come again before dawn." "I know, you could leave. I can manage what remains of the night alone." "Yeah," he said, "I know that too." He looked at his frying pan. There was a new dent in it that hadn't been there before. He thought about his mother, who had given it to him on his birthday and said, in her dry way, that a man who didn't know how to cook was a liability to everyone around him. "Tell me how many more there will be," he said, "and tell me what they'll bring with them. And tell me if there's anything in this apartment that could help." She told him. They spent the next hour preparing. This was perhaps the most human thing June had ever done, without knowing it was human. The improvisational construction of defenses from ordinary materials by someone who is frightened, but not stopped by being frightened. He repurposed a standing lamp, a section of copper pipe from under the sink, 2 cans of cooking spray, and a motion sensor from an old security camera his neighbor had left in his storage unit 2 years ago and never retrieved. Mona watched him work and suggested modifications, and the modifications were good, and together they made something out of almost nothing that had a reasonable chance of working. "Your species does this," she said, watching him wire the sensor to the lamp switch. "Repurpose, improvise. I have observed it in others, but not at this proximity. We're very good at making weapons out of kitchen appliances," he agreed. "It is not only weapons, the repurposing extends to," she paused, "to emotional materials as well. Using what you have, my species lost that somewhere in our development. We became very precise, and precision is efficient, but it is also brittle. We cannot use a frying pan to protect someone. I did a bad job of it," he said. "You did a completely unreasonable job of it," she said. "That is different." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Mona," he said, "why do you need to be here specifically? You said there were others who turned away. You could go anywhere." She met his eyes. Her gaze was steady and dark and very direct. "The competing faction is tracking my biological signature. I cannot move without alerting them to my direction. I have been stationary here long enough that they have converged. If I run now, I am exposed in open ground, and they will take what they want by force before dawn. So you're here because you have nowhere else to go." "Yes, and the vow. I told you. The process requires consent, and it requires." She paused in the careful way of someone translating poorly, what I would call genuine present-tense willingness, not decision, not logic. Something closer to wanting. Coerced material is biologically inert. It simply will not work. She looked away briefly. I cannot compel you. I cannot even persuade you by making the stakes very clear. Because that is also a form of coercion. It must come from you freely, or it comes from something. He thought about this. That's a remarkably inconvenient reproductive system, he said. We were shaped to evolution like everyone else, she said, and something in her voice was almost dry. It was not designed for my convenience. He finished wiring the lamp. He thought about the conversation they'd had, all of it. The Jenga and the rice and the second shadows and his father's fence and the 40 words for transparency. He thought about how she had answered every question without evasion. How she had told him about the competing faction and what would come if they won, not because it would convince him, but because she'd said he deserved to know. He thought about what it meant to be a person who turned toward. I want to ask you something, he said. Yes. Earlier, when you were describing your homeworld, the green sky, you said you missed it. I said I missed my second shadow, same thing. She was quiet. Do you want to go home, he asked. The question landed in the room and stayed there. Outside, the first gray edge of false dawn was barely visible through the gap in the curtains. She said, I have not allowed myself to think about that. Why? Because wanting to go home and being unable to go home is a very specific kind of pain, and feeling it while also trying to accomplish a necessary task is inefficient. But you want to. Yes, she said quietly. Very much. There is a sound there. The wind in certain rock formations at the western edge of the place where I was born, that I have been unable to hear for 3 years. I have tried to reproduce it with available materials, and I cannot. She looked at her own hands for a moment. Your species has music. I have listened to a great deal of it since I arrived. There are several pieces that are close, but not the same. He reached across the table and set the sensor down and looked at her. Okay, he said. She looked up. I want to help you go home, he said. Not because of the stakes and not because of the competing faction, and not because I'm scared of what happens if you fail. Because you told me the truth all night, and you played Jenga with me, and you were kind about my father, and because you haven't once tried to make me feel like I owe you anything. He paused. And because I think you've been transparent on a planet that doesn't know your name for 3 years, and that's long enough. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences in the apartment that night. It was a full silence, a completed thing. I would like that, she said. The men came again at 5:15, as dawn was turning the horizon a dirty rose. There were 8 of them this time, and they had something that might have been weapons, or might have been instruments, and it didn't much matter because the lamp and sensor rig went off when the first of them stepped through the window, and the cooking spray gave the second one in the door something serious to think about. And by the time June made it to the front room with the section of copper pipe in his hand, 3 of them were already dealing with problems he'd left for them. He was scared. He wanted to be clear, even in his own head, that he was scared, that his hands were not steady, and his breathing was wrong, and his ribs from earlier were filing formal complaints with every movement. He'd read enough about heroism to be suspicious of the stories that left the fear out. The way they made the protagonist seem like a person who moved through danger on principle, untroubled by the ordinary human machinery of self-preservation. He was troubled. He was very troubled. He swung the pipe anyway. The fight moved through his apartment the way fights did. Suddenly and incomprehensibly, the furniture transformed into obstacles and cover simultaneously. He lost track of Mona for a moment and his heart lurched, and then he saw her at the window. Her hand extended toward 2 men who were trying to get in from the fire escape. And they were stuck, simply stopped, hanging on the metal railing like laundry, and her face was something extraordinary, focused past distress into a kind of clean purpose that was almost serene. He took a knee to the shoulder and went down, caught himself on the kitchen counter, and came up swinging at the man who'd put him there. Later he would not be able to reconstruct the sequence exactly. He knew that at some point there were fewer of them, and at some point there were none of them, and at some point he was sitting on his kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator and the copper pipe across his knees, and the apartment was very quiet. Mona crouched in front of him. June, I'm okay, he said. I know, she studied his face. I wanted to say your name, he breathed out. His ribs were louder than ever. Through the window he could see the sky going pale. Real pale now, the rose deepening toward an ordinary blue. Dawn, he said. Yes, she said. In approximately 20 minutes. Is there time? If we choose to use it. He looked at her. She looked at him. The apartment was wrecked. The lamp was on its side. One chair was in two pieces. There was something sticky on the linoleum that he was going to have to deal with. And it was also very quiet, the particular quiet of a place where something finished. He thought about his father, who had died because he couldn't leave something alone, and about the years he'd spent trying to be less like him, and about the night just past, which had demonstrated with some finality that the inheritance was lodged somewhere the will couldn't reach. He thought about her second shadow, and the green sky and the wind in the rock formations, that nothing on Earth could exactly reproduce. He thought, "What is the right thing, and you never know in advance, you just have to pick one," he said. "Tell me what I need to do." The process was not what he'd expected. It was close and quiet, and nothing like the clinical extraction he'd braced himself for. There was warmth and a low sound she made that was almost a tone, almost music, and a feeling that reminded him of nothing so much as the moment just before waking when the dream is still coherent and you haven't lost it yet. Everything present and lit. After he sat by the window, the sky was blue-gray and ordinary, and the street below was beginning to register the first thin sounds of morning. A distant truck, someone's door, a bicycle. Mona sat beside him, her shoulder just touching his. "Is it?" he started. "Yes," she said, complete. He exhaled. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now I send the signal and they send extraction. 48 of your hours." She paused. "I will not be able to return. The mission will be complete and there will be other work. In other systems." "What about the competing faction?" "Without the material they need, their timeline collapses. They will consolidate and regroup, but it will take several of your years. My faction will use that time." She looked at her hands. "Your planet will not be bothered." "That's good," he said. "Yes." The light in the room was changing as the sun came up, going from gray to pale gold, the way it did in late autumn when the air was clean after rain. A sparrow landed on the window ledge outside and considered them both and departed. "Mona," he said. "Yes, the offspring." He stopped. "The child." "I don't know the right word." "There is no equivalent word," she said. "It will be its own category of being. Neither what I am nor what you are. Will it be okay?" She was quiet a moment. He thought she might not have an answer, or might decline to give it. But she turned toward him and her face had that open quality again, the seam-giving-way look. "I will tell it," she said, "about the city where its material comes from. About the man who makes rice badly and plays Jenga and picks up pieces of pipe for strangers at midnight. About a father who couldn't leave broken things alone." She paused. "I will tell it what we have in our language for what that is. Approximately in your language it is someone who turns toward." The words were just words, he knew that, but they filled the room the way music fills a room, taking up more space than sound should. He nodded. He couldn't find anything to say, and he'd learned, somewhere across the long strange night, that silence in the right company was not absence. They sat there while the city woke up outside, and the sparrow came back, and the light went from pale gold to proper morning. His ribs ached. The apartment smelled like cold coffee, and something burnt from the cooking spray incident, and the faint, sweet, strange scent that he had already started, without meaning to think of as simply her. He was going to have to call in sick to work. He was going to have to explain the door. He was going to spend a great deal of time, probably, in the coming months, sitting in this same chair, wondering whether what he'd done was right, and never being sure, and having to be okay with not being sure. But that was the inheritance. You picked one and you lived with it. He looked at the window, at the ordinary blue of a planet that had spent the last several hours not becoming a different place, and thought about how most mornings there was no way to know which moments were the ones that mattered. No marker, no score, just the sound in the alley and the turn of a body toward it, and everything that follows from a single choice made in half a second in the rain. He thought about second shadows, and the green sky, and how far someone might travel carrying the specific shape of a place inside them. He thought, I hope the wind sounds the way she remembers it. Outside, the street filled with ordinary sound, and the morning came in like it always does, unasked for and sufficient, the same sun on a changed world.